Good evening. Great to see so many of you here this evening, although once they turn out the lights, I can't see any of you anymore. I'm Michael Halloran, the provost at William & Mary, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's 9th Tack faculty lecture given by Anne-Marie Stock, professor of Hispanic Studies and Film and Media Studies here at the college. Now, the premise of establishing this lecture series was simple. Our intellectual energy as a university comes first and foremost from the creative work of our faculty as they conduct research and lead students into greater understanding and new knowledge. So we should not hide our light under a bushel, but rather let it shine brightly. Carl and Martha Tack, both class of 1978, recognized the value of displaying this intellectual energy in a public forum, and through their endowment, we will be able to enjoy the Tack faculty lectures in perpetuity. I should also add that Carl and Martha's William & Mary's roots extend over 4 generations, and Carl frequently teaches at the Mason School of Business. Although I can still see them, thankfully. Carl and Martha are here this evening, so let me thank you both. Anne-Marie Stock joined the William & Mary faculty in 1993, having just completed her PhD at the University of Minnesota in cultural studies with an emphasis on Latin American cinema. Immediately, she introduced film courses into what was then the Spanish curriculum, now Hispanic Studies, and helped found the Film Studies minor, now a vibrant interdisciplinary major in Film and Media Studies. From her very first year at William & Mary, it was clear that Anne-Marie was going to engage students in her research, much of it related to Cuba. She did this in a variety of ways, translating an array of texts, subtitling documentaries, filming interviews, curating exhibitions, etc. She was among the first to invite students to join her on research trips outside the country, and I hear, and I love thinking about this, in the early 1990s, she and a student were in the University of Mexico Film Archives watching wrestling movies for an article they were jointly preparing. I have to see the film version of that. Her work has received wide recognition, both for its scholarly significance and its pedagogical innovation. Professor Stock has support from the National Endowment in the Humanities, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Freeman Foundation, and several others. She has accepted invitations for numerous residencies and fellowships, including as a Fulbright Scholar Lecturer in Costa Rica, a Museum Fellow at the Smithsonian Institution, and was the first U.S. scholar to be in residence as both the National Film Institute and the non-governmental Ludwig Foundation in Havana. She is also a recent winner of a Plumeria Award for Faculty Excellence here on campus. Dr. Stock's commitment to engaged teaching and learning has gone well beyond serving her institute. Her commitment to engaged teaching and groundbreaking scholarship has not kept her from serving our institution in other ways. In addition to her role on myriad committees, she has served as Director of Hispanic Studies, Director of Film and Media Studies, Acting Dean of International Affairs, with 6 additional years in leadership positions at the Reeves Center for International Studies. Now, I should also add that her service to the community in college has extended beyond these formal positions. For example, when William & Mary hosted a Salvadoran poet for a semester and needed accommodations, Anne-Marie opened her home. She opened her home again for a business school student from Costa Rica who was on a very limited budget. He lived with her for 2 years. Her work has consistently connected her and led her back to Cuba for over 2 decades, during many years of which such travel and research were accomplished only through extraordinary efforts. She has enriched our campus by bringing to Williamsburg dozens of Cuban filmmakers, writers, and artists. She has enhanced our knowledge by introducing ideas and sharing discoveries related to Cuban culture in 4 books and more than 100 scholarly essays. And she has strengthened our institution by building bridges among disciplines and helping develop relationships among individuals. Now, I suspect she will not take credit for President Obama's recent reopening of relations with Cuba. But I think we can all enjoy the serendipity of this evening's lecture coming only a week after the President's visit to Havana. Tonight, as the Tack faculty lecturer, Professor Stock will explore with us her deep research and insights on Cuban film and society in her talk, Remix and Revolution in Cuba. Anne-Marie.
Thank you. Gracias. Thank you for that beautiful introduction, and thanks all of you for that really warm welcome. I'm so pleased to be here this evening among students, among colleagues, among dear friends in the community. I have to say I'm kind of blown away by seeing people who over the years have connected with me with Cuba in some way. So a warm welcome to all of you, and a warm welcome too to those participating online, friends in a variety of countries, and also members of my family in several states. I have a very large family, and so thanks for being part of this very special evening. When I have come back from Cuba many times over almost 30 years now, I've almost always been asked the same two questions. I'm going to start my remarks tonight with the first question, and then toward the end of the talk, I'll get to that second question. The first question, Anne-Marie, do you have any cigars? I actually do have some cigars, and I was suggesting that maybe I could leave one on each seat as kind of a little door prize for each of you, but I was dissuaded from that. Apparently there's this fire marshal thing, or anyway, that wasn't going to work out. What do we think of when we think of Cuba? What comes to mind immediately are cigars, old cars, colorful cocktails. Can anyone recognize this particular version? Mojito, you're right. Okay. Our images of Cuba are stereotypes for the most part. Many of us have not had the opportunity to be there. So when we think of Cuba, we think of two-dimensional characters in predictable plots. We think of bombshells, often with maracas, or we think of bearded revolutionaries. These stereotypes persist. They stick in our heads the way this fruit basket sticks on the head of Carmen Miranda, no matter how much twirling and whirling she seems to do. Cuba remains an enigma. Most of us in the US don't know much about the country, only 90 miles off the shores of Florida. The politics and practices of both governments have resulted in keeping us apart, have resulted in keeping people in the US and Cuba in the dark about one another for more than a half century. We tend, as a result, to envision the island of Cuba as stuck in time, as a place that's not changing, as a place that's static. Frozen, if you will. For the past 3 decades, I've been exploring a different image of the island. I've been looking at the ways in which Cubans imagine their own world through cinema. And this evening, I want to take you on location in Cuba to share some highlights. I want to talk about how Cuban filmmakers depict their changing island, and I want to give you a sense of how William and Mary connects with Cuba's culture and people, through my work, but also through the work of other colleagues, and certainly through the work of students. What you will see is a remix of creativity, collaboration, and connectedness. Revolutionary cinema in Cuba dates back to the very beginning, to 1959, 1960, when, in the second decree of the new government, a film institute was established. This is a time in Cuba where supporters of the revolution were celebrating the triumph, the euphoria, and detractors of the revolution were experiencing loss and disillusionment. But it was a time when culture was going to be at the very center of creating this new identity. For people not familiar with Cuba, it's striking to see how central culture is in the country, how central culture is on the island. I recall an experience from 2002 when I was part of a delegation consulting with the Center for Defense Information, and our task was to help the U.S. Coast Guard and their counterparts in Cuba team up to intervene in potential terrorist threats and drug trafficking. We had a very successful week of conversations, made a great deal of progress, and as a result, we got invited by Fidel Castro to the presidential palace for dinner. We were milling around and discussing our work of the week, talking about world events, but the conversation came back time and time again to culture, to art, to theater, to dance, and to film. And not just to Cuba's culture, it was to worldwide culture. The conversation came back to Disney films as well as Japanese anime. We talked about British pop music as well as border-crossing hip-hop. Culture was everywhere present that evening. And I think my US companions were very surprised by that. So that's something I would like to emphasize for us here this evening. Culture is at the very center from the beginning of the revolution. Within the realm of culture, cinema was deemed to be the mode through which revolutionary ideals would be disseminated, through which the Cuban people would be educated, and a principal mode of entertainment as well. Through film, notions of citizenship would be defined, relationships to the state would be negotiated, and alliances would be forged. For the past half century then, in Cuba, film has been an arbiter of identity. One Cuban writer, Senel Paz, has said of the 1960s, I remember that during those years, I went to the cinema not to see films, but to become Cuban. He, like so many other Cubans, went to the movies to learn how to be Cuban. What images and sounds would be selected to portray and indeed create this emerging cinema culture? How would an authentic film language be forged? The filmmakers experimented, and for the most part they succeeded, as evidenced by the quality and quantity of the output from those early years. Cuban films, and here I'm speaking of all kinds of films, newsreels, documentaries, animation, feature films, they captured the turbulent 1960s on the island and around the world. Films about literacy achievements in Cuba, films about the trauma of race riots in the US, films about the euphoria over man stepping onto the moon. These films impressed audiences at home and abroad. Some works from 1960s Cuba are still deemed to be extraordinary accomplishments. The film Memories of Underdevelopment, for example, consistently makes its way onto the list of the world's 100 best films of all time. And the short documentary by Santiago Alvarez, Now, is deemed to be one of the precursors of the music video, if not the precursor. Cubans, of course, would say it's the precursor. They're very proud of their national cinema. Some film projects went unmade because the subject matter or genre or treatment was incompatible with the state's priorities and political agendas of the time. In fact, right now in the BobSatoh Gallery in Swem Library, there's a student-curated exhibit of posters that feature these ghost films, or films that were never made in Cuba. I'll talk a bit more about this later, but know that you're invited to stop by and take a look at that. So I mentioned that some films went unmade. Excuse me. Other films that were made did not circulate widely or even at all. On occasion, a filmmaker who felt his creativity was stifled left the island for good. Overall, however, for 30 years, Cuba's National Film Institute, the ICAIC, served as the engine driving the creation of remarkable films and their widespread circulation. Cuba's industry was a model for other nations and regions looking to develop a vibrant film tradition. Cuba inspired the new Latin American cinema movement, for example, and also the third cinema movement. Cuba was also important as a festival center. The International Festival of New Latin American Cinema, held each December in Havana, has been and continues to be a hub for film in the Americas. And Cuba's fanatical film goers were the envy of directors and cinema owners around the world. It's unbelievable. During the festival, Cubans will save up vacation all year so as to take it during the entire duration of this 2-week festival, and they'll think nothing of seeing 4 films a day. And then came 1989, a pivotal year in many parts of the world, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, the dismantling of the Berlin Wall, and the ending of the Cold War. But to say that this was a pivotal year in Cuba, a pivotal moment, would be a gross understatement. It was devastating. The loss of its ally and major trading partner left the small island nation floundering. What resulted was a severe economic crisis, shortages of everything, even the most basic goods like food, and widespread uncertainty. What was becoming of Cuba? What would it mean to be Cuban in moving forward? During the summer of 1994, some of you may recall the BobSatoh Crisis, when some 35,000 Cubans floated away from the island on makeshift rafts, some to wash up on the shores of Florida, and others to be engulfed by the sea. It was the special period. I recall experiences from those years. I was going to Cuba on research trips during the special period. I recall meeting with my mentor, one of Cuba's leading intellectuals, Ambrosio Fornet, and he was writing an essay, and he was using the margin, not even the backside, because both sides of the page had already been used. He was writing in the margin of a previously used sheet of paper. And he joked that in Cuba, paperback writer meant something else. Incredible how Cubans retained their sense of humor during this really difficult time. I remember going to a theater with the director of a play that was being staged. And we walked into this dark venue. We got there early. And he reached into his pocket and he pulled out a light bulb and he screwed it into the socket. And he explained that light bulbs were so scarce and that he only had this one for the theater. He didn't dare to leave it and risk it being lost. Most grueling of all, though, the most difficult memories have to do with going to the homes of my friends at the time, seeing the conditions in which they were living. I remember a friend who was sharing what he didn't have. He invited me for a meal. And he opened the refrigerator, and there I saw a pitcher of water and some grapefruit rinds. These rinds were breaded and fried, and they were considered steak at the time. So a time of uncertainty, a time of dislocation, a time of darkness. It was during this time that the filmmaker Fernando Perez was working on a project titled Madagascar. He recalls that time, and he says every day he worked on the film, and every day he did so thinking it would be the last day he'd ever be a filmmaker. He said he was concerned that there wouldn't be food to feed the crew, that there wouldn't be gasoline to move the equipment, that there wouldn't be electricity to charge the batteries that were needed to operate the cameras. It was a very difficult time in Cuba, one that almost no one thought Cubans would emerge from. Let's take a look at a clip of Fernando Perez's film, Madagascar, to get a feel for this dark, bleak time. You'll note his reliance on tones of blues and grays. That's simply the tone of the time.
Pero se pasa todo el día así, ensimismada, mirando quién sabe a dónde y sin decir una sola palabra. Hasta físicamente ha cambiado. Solo le importan sus 2 ratones. Yo también tuve ratones, pero no fue para tanto. ¿Y tú no piensas desempacar tus cosas? Vas a convertirte en una gitana.
Me voy de viaje. Me voy de viaje para Madagascar.
¿Para dónde?
Para Madagascar.
¿Pero qué locura es esa, Laurita? ¿Tú sabes la estupidez que tú estás diciendo?
No es una estupidez. Es lo que no conozco.
Cuba survived this crisis against all odds. How did it manage to do so? By expanding its tourist infrastructure and attracting visitors from around the world, by seeking and securing foreign investment through joint ventures, by tolerating and even encouraging private enterprise. This was the time of the creation of family-run restaurants, bed and breakfasts, farmers markets, craft stands, bicycle taxis, and by forging new partnerships, bringing non-governmental organizations onto the island and collaborating with partners in other countries. So Cuba survived by changing, by adapting, by connecting. This island was anything but frozen in time. As you might imagine, the film world changed dramatically too. Some of the changes had to do with the special period and circumstances in Cuba. Other changes had to do with the changing landscape of film worldwide. I documented this moment in Cuba's film world in my book devoted to street filmmaking, a time of transition when filmmakers worked between the state-supported industry and the growing private sector, between industry and indie. During this time, co-production came to replace state financing. New themes were tackled and new genres employed. New partnerships were developed with these new non-governmental organizations, with state organizations on the island, and with partners in other countries. And emerging technologies were embraced. It was during this time that 35 millimeter gave way to analog video and then digital, and truckloads of heavy equipment began to be replaced by lightweight cameras and small crews. As a result, a new generation of very agile, very talented filmmakers emerged. They shared a desire to experiment and a knack for innovation. What they didn't have, they invented. The word of the day for these filmmakers was resolver, make do, make it happen, just make it work. So you don't have any transportation for your project? Grab your bicycle and pedal around Havana. No dolly? Borrow a TV cart, or maybe even a wheelchair. No light reflectors? How about a sofa cushion? These are all examples that filmmakers shared with me during interviews. So these are fixes that they actually used. No money to pay professionals? Gather your family and friends. And that's just what Juan Carlos Cremata did. Juan Carlos Cremata was thinking about a major feature film that required a large budget. He pitched that project to the Film Institute, and it was turned down. So rather than sacrifice his idea for the film to do a low-budget version, which he didn't think would be possible, rather than just walk away disgruntled, he got to work on another project. And what he did was created the idea for a road movie that would involve two 11-year-old children who run away from home and cross the island of Cuba. He titled this Viva Cuba. He had a very low budget, and so he had to think about ways to do things on the cheap. One of the ways he did this was to engage his entire family, and fortunately he comes from a very talented family. So his mother produced the film, his cousin composed the music, his brother, who leads a theater troupe, selected and trained the two child actors, and can you guess who played the grandmother? His abuelita played the grandmother in the film. He also had a very talented crew, people who were adept at making fixes on the fly. I spoke with his camera operator, Alejandro Perez, and he was telling me about some of the ways he was able to resolver, he was able to make do. So for example, in one sequence, he had envisioned, or the director had envisioned, the two children running through the woods. Well, to get that shot, he would have liked to have had a dolly, laid tracks, and then moved that piece of equipment to follow the children. Didn't have that, didn't have the money to rent it, even if it had been available, didn't have the time to add another day to the production in order to make that happen. So what did he do? He drew a circle by the woods, in a clearing in the woods. He had the children run around that circle. He put a pole in the middle, hung a camera on it, spun the pole, and got the shot he needed. And that's the shot we're going to take a look at right now. What you'll notice is the ways in which a clearing in the woods repeats at regular intervals. Ingenuity. This film was very successful. It's been shown at film festivals in many countries. In fact, we just showed it here last semester as part of an international independent film series in the BobSatoh Auditorium, so I think some of you here actually would have seen that. And it positioned the filmmaker to go on and do his next work. Juan Carlos Cremata is one of the Cuban filmmakers who has visited us here at William & Mary. He was the first Cuban filmmaker I invited and came to the college back in 1994. My former colleague Jim Griffin will recall us hosting Juan Carlos Cremata back in the day. It was quite wonderful. There are other filmmakers who have come to William & Mary. I want to mention just a few of them by way of wrapping up the first part of this presentation in order to show the variety of the themes they work with, the range of stories they're interested in, and also the tendency right now among Cuban filmmakers to be widely connected, to be dealing with multiple traditions. So if we have a notion of Cuba as completely isolated, I think the experiences and examples of these filmmakers will invite us to rethink that. Esteban Insausti has just begun work on a film called Jazz Club. This is going to be a feature-length film that deals with the stories of 3 accomplished jazz musicians as they make their way during the heyday of jazz between Havana and New York. In the center of the slide, you'll see the actress Zulema Clares, very talented Cuban actress who works sometimes in theater in New York and sometimes in film projects in Cuba. Oneida Gonzalez and Gustavo Perez are at work on a documentary about the poet named Severo Sarduy. Severo Sarduy was born in Cuba, grew up in the town of Camagüey, left for Paris in his 20s, and never returned. So in some ways, he's one of these poets without a nation. He doesn't completely belong to Cuba, nor does he completely belong to France. Oneida and Gustavo are devoting their documentary to his life, and in order to do that, they've filmed interviews in Paris, in Havana, Camagüey, Princeton, New Jersey, and Miami. Alfredo Ureta has just completed a documentary about a group of Cuban baseball players, a young team that went to Florida, the first baseball players, Little League baseball players, to travel from Cuba to Florida in something like, since the 1940s, I believe. And his documentary shares the experience of that competition as well as their delight at going to Disney and getting to a major league ballpark. Right now, he's working on getting financing for a feature film, and get this, it's going to be a thriller. It's called Infiltrated Paradise, and it's about US tourists in Cuba. So he's looking for investors. If any of you are feeling entrepreneurial, I'm happy to pass along some contact information. Carlos Rodriguez, a friend. There's a group of students here you'll hear more about. We just spent a week in Cuba over spring break, and Carlos Rodriguez was one of the Cubans who helped host us. He's working on a documentary that's very personal. It's called Rodriguez versus Rodriguez, and it's about his mother and his father. His mother is a heroine of the Cuban Revolution. His father is a detractor. His father left the country when Carlos was a baby. Carlos has no memory of his father in his life when he was growing up. With this film project, he's bringing their stories together. He's also reuniting them in real life. His plan is to bring them together. So again, border-crossing stories. So I mentioned these filmmakers have been to William & Mary, and what I want to do is give a bit more information about some of the ways William and Mary has connected with Cuba and with Cuba's culture. In order to begin to talk about connecting William and Mary and Cuba in terms of this film work, I need to take us back for a moment to 1993. It was the time of Cuba's special period, as I mentioned, a time of uncertainty that Fernando Perez was documenting in Madagascar. And it was a time when I had just taken a position at the college. I received a phone call, and it was a call from Cuba. It was a call from Fernando Perez. And he said, Ana Maria, I just learned that my eldest child, my only son, has decided to emigrate. He's leaving me and moving to the US. My heart is breaking. The only way I can bear this is if I know he goes into good hands, if he goes to a good home. And I think I had my response out before he even asked the question. He said, could you take him? Claro que sí, Fernando. Por supuesto que sí. Fran Ernesto, named after Ernesto Che Guevara, came to the US. He arrived in Newport News with his very small carry-on, with his worldly possessions, and in that very small carry-on was a little ceramic coffee set that he brought. And Fran lived with my husband David and me for the next 3 years while he learned English. He earned his degree, he worked 2 jobs, and he became encaminado. He forged his path into the future. As you might imagine, that was a powerful experience for me. That was a privilege, and it was instrumental as I was forging my path as a professional here at the college. It became clear that my journey would involve fostering creativity, engendering collaboration, and forging connections. It would be a path on which I experimented with what it meant to teach with research and to empower students as scholars. And it was a path that would keep me connected with Cuba. With that, I'd like to turn to a few highlights from along the way. Part of the work I've done has had to do with documenting what's going on in Cuba's film world, and that, of course, has been a window into the larger world on the island. What you'll see here is a short video that captures images. Troy Davis, a colleague in SWEM Library, the Director of Media Services, and I filmed. We were on location with Alfredo Ureta as he was making a feature film. He generously invited us in, allowed us to move around, and our challenge was to stay out of his shot, particularly, as you'll notice, when we're in a very tiny bathroom with a lot of people. So this will give you a sense of what it feels like, what it looks like to be doing film research some of the time.
Guantanamera, Guajira, Guantanamera. Yo soy un hombre sincero, de donde crece la palma. Antes de morir yo quiero echar mi verso del alma. Guantanamera.
Ok, vienen.
Guajira, Guantanamera.
¿Listos?
Listo.
Corre sonido.
Corre.
Corre cámara.
Corre cámara.
Secuencia 42-1-1.
Acción.
Camina.
Hoy yo le quiero cantar porque la rumba está buena. Hoy yo le quiero cantar porque la rumba está buena. Hoy quiero cantar, hoy quiero bailar, hoy quiero tomar porque la rumba está buena. Hoy quiero cantar, hoy quiero bailar, hoy quiero tomar porque la rumba está buena. La tarde tocando el 3, Olivares, la marícula. La tarde tocando el 3, Olivares, la marícula. El guayo toca cabrón, las maracas PPP, la vera con los bongos, cuando se siente repicar. Porque la rumba está buena. El guayo toca cabrón, las maracas PPP, la vera con los bongos, cuando se siente repicar. Porque la rumba está buena. Ay, vamos a parrandear, porque la rumba está buena.
Vamos a parrandear, porque la rumba está buena.
Cero, aquí la rumba está buena.
Vamos a parrandear, porque la rumba está buena.
Timbero, aquí la rumba está buena.
Vamos a parrandear, porque la rumba está buena.
Ay, ya lo digo la también, aquí la rumba está buena. Ajá. Chap, chap. La gente de la loma del chivo, váyalo. Camina, chef.
And these are images of some of the many individuals who have joined us at William & Mary. We have film directors, but we also have an editor, a producer, a special effects technician, and a designer. So it's a way for William & Mary students to connect with a whole range of individuals involved in creating and circulating films. This material then can be used for research purposes. So for example, to put into the next book. It can also be used by students for remixing and creating their own media projects. We share this material in community presentations, campus and community presentations. We also invite filmmakers for that same purpose, and students often participate in organizing those events, in introducing our guests, and in sharing information about their work. The impact of inviting these filmmakers obviously benefits us, but the filmmakers say it's also really important for them. In most cases, their visit to William & Mary was their first visit to the US. So they came directly from Cuba, made their way to Williamsburg, and from here, then they're able to develop more contacts and get a better sense of this country. So I feel as though we've been important ambassadors for them. While these filmmakers are at William & Mary, we also always interview them. Students, again, participate in the process. They study the work of these filmmakers ahead of time. They prepare the interview questions, ask them, film the interview, edit it, and later promote it. Some of these projects have been disseminated quite widely in presentations at conferences and even as works at film festivals. This material also is useful in publishing. This image is of a faculty, librarian, student collaboration. I edited a volume, World Film Locations, Havana, and it involves contributors from 6 different countries. So from Cuba, certainly, and the US, but also from Wales, from Canada, from Spain, and I believe it's from Australia. And it's wonderful that in addition to that international mix, we have a campus collaboration, and we have a student who's now published in there, Emma Rodvin. Another way that we connect with Cuban filmmakers and with Cuba's cinema tradition is through subtitling. Early on, when I was teaching film here at the college and looking to get films from Latin America in general and from Cuba in particular, it was really difficult to get high-quality copies. It wasn't that they were widely distributed. You know, it was maybe making a copy from someone else's copy. It would be going to these film festivals, bringing back VHS tapes. In any case, I thought for many years, gosh, I wish someone would just take it upon themselves to pull this material together, subtitle it, and package it up for US universities. And I'm ashamed to say how many years I thought that before I actually took the initiative, met with the Film Institute and said, what would you think about this idea? And they said, we think it's brilliant. Go for it. So they opened their archives to me. I had the opportunity to screen a whole range of documentaries, select what I wanted to work with for thematic volumes in this DVD series called Cuban Cinema Classics. And my students have worked with me on that. We've worked in the Reader Media Center to translate, to subtitle, and I'm pleased to say that many of my colleagues in modern languages and literatures and in film and media studies are also working in this way, connecting our institution with filmmakers worldwide. Let's take a look at what we see when we think about a subtitling workshop at William & Mary. This video is a student-created project.
Todavía no ha tocado la luna. El hombre está en su más grande momento.
So this experience for students, as you might imagine, has a tremendous impact. They enhance their Spanish language proficiency. They certainly refine their new media literacy. And it's not only important for our students, but it's important for the filmmakers as well. They tell us, in fact, that thanks to the efforts of our students of these kinds of projects, their work gets into international film festivals. Oftentimes they need these English language subtitles in order to submit a work to an international festival. So our students are empowered by being cultural agents. Their creativity is helping foster the creativity of others. I'd next like to talk about collaboration. Oftentimes, when these filmmakers come to William and Mary, there are unexpected outcomes. Take the case of the visit by Miguel Coyula. Miguel was working on a film, now completed, called Memories of Development. He came to town, and during our couple of days with him, he said, would there be a chance to get into an art cinema in town? I need to film a sequence for my next project, and I really need to get into an art cinema. Well, we're fortunate in Williamsburg to have the Kimball Theater. I called the Kimball, and after putting in motion a few things, students and I went over to the Kimball with Miguel, with his equipment. He sat up, he sat us down, and as a result, you are seeing us in his film. These are the backs of our heads. He filmed us, and then with the green screen was able to use this footage for his film. So we never thought we'd make it into a Cuban film. And I have to say it's a short piece. I didn't use the entire clip. Just a photograph was enough to give you a sense of this unexpected way of collaborating. All of this material that we film then becomes part of our growing collection of material related to Cuba. This past summer, I led a trip to Havana with a team of directors and the dean of our university libraries. Our goals were to develop partnerships with cultural institutions, archives, libraries on the island, and also to gather more materials, specifically posters and handmade books. While we were there, we had a variety of experiences. As you might imagine, we met with a number of artists, creators. We gathered posters that you'll see in the next slide related to our exhibit. Here I'd like to point out my colleagues on the left. I'm sure we're on our way to a library or archive. On the right, you see Laura Ruiz, a Cuban poet who's dedicating a book to William and Mary. She graciously hosted us at Ediciones Vigía, a handmade book workshop. These materials are really important for student projects. They're also accessed by faculty. Professor McCoy in business, for example, Professor Turretts in history also use these materials with their students. Here are examples of the ways we've used some of these materials, specifically the ghost posters that we acquired just this past summer. As part of a course that I'm co-teaching, students curated an exhibit. They selected the posters, arranged them, and this is now available for the community. So not just learning at William and Mary, but access for the much wider community. We'll be doing a digital exhibit moving forward, and so they'll be accessible far beyond William and Mary for a long time to come. And that's part of our next initiative, which is really organizing, inventorying, and ensuring the widest spread access possible. We have this really beautiful array with 32 terabytes of storage. We haven't filled that up yet, but we're working on it, and we're very excited about possibilities for continuing to capture this time of transformation, accelerated change between Cuba and the U.S., and to continue rendering more accessible all of these rich materials that we're creating and that we're collecting. I want to emphasize not just the act of collecting, but also this act of creating. And I'm grateful for the partnership with university libraries in making this happen. Speaking of partnerships, there are so many other people who have made exciting initiatives possible. Here you're about to see one. This is footage from a spring break trip just 2 weeks ago, an amazing piece of creativity by William and Mary students.
Cada momento es una aventura aquí y cada día está lleno de sorpresa. No quiero volver a dormir en Cuba. E incluso después de que he vuelto a casa y el lugar ha desaparecido por completo de la vista, me parece que me persigue como una rumba distante.
They are something, aren't they? I would like to invite the participants in the New Media Workshop, Curate, Connect, Cuba, to stand up, and let's just give them one more applause. Thank you. So they have agreed to stick around for the reception. They have agreed to wear their orange t-shirts. I can't believe I made them do that, but they're so, they get the solidarity thing. They said, yes, we'll do that for you. So feel free to seek them out after this talk and speak with them about their experiences. We see here we're one member of our group on the right, David Culver, an alumnus. And this is kind of an interesting development. Study abroad, if you will. This idea for the trip actually was inspired by the new CALL curriculum. CALL 300 is a course that has at its core connecting with cultures that are unfamiliar. And so we decided to add this spring break trip to Cuba as part of our workshop. And David Culver, a student who was in the very first New Media Workshop several years back, signed on to join us as an alumnus. He's now a reporter and anchor for NBC4 in Washington, D.C. So current students had an opportunity to spend time with this alumnus, pick his brain, learn from him. And David is becoming one of the people at NBC who goes to Cuba regularly to cover events there. This is both of us in Havana in August, just this past August, when we went together for the flag raising at the U.S. Embassy in Havana. It was an amazing full circle moment for me because here was a student who had been in this New Media Workshop, who had learned about Cuba, who had gotten his hands dirty working with film, with media. He's now a reporter anchor, and he called me and said, Anne-Marie, any chance you'd want to join NBC and me to cover the events in Cuba? And I said, well, twist my arm. He said, well, I'd need you to field produce. I'd need you to help share contacts, people I could, feature. He said, and I said, I absolutely, count me in. And he said, and I'd need you to be on camera live. And I thought, oh, this isn't really, yes, of course I'll do it. So I did it. It was a new experience for me, but I think what's beautiful is this full circle of William and Mary students moving out into the world, remaining connected with other students who are still on their journey. Connections, connectedness. One of the underlying themes of my work with Cuba, with all of our work at William and Mary, is establishing relationships, establishing connections. That can only happen with partnerships. So many of you in this room have done your part to help move us forward as an institution, to help inspire learning at William and Mary. It will be impossible for me to thank each of you, but know that I'm really grateful for everything you all have done and continue to do with us and for us. And given that some of these people are in the audience, I can't resist just running down the list with a few names. So I'll first say, this was a wonderful group of lifelong learners, William and Mary alumni for the most part, who accompanied me to Cuba on a study trip. Sue Gertelman, Linda Montgomery, skipping over me, we have Martha Tack, Karen Cottrell, Kathy Hornsby, and Nancy Matthews. And there are other partners in crime, travelers in crime out here in the audience. So thanks to all of you for remaining connected to William and Mary. Thanks to all of you for what you do for this institution. And I now have to get back to that second question that I told you I would conclude with. When is Cuba going to open up? I've been asked that question so many times, and I think what the speaker generally means is, when will the US and Cuba change the nature of the relationship? I'm so enthused to be able to say this is happening. Seeing President Obama, the Pope, Tampa Bay baseball players, the Rolling Stones, hearing from my friends in Cuba about these events, and reading the media about these events, it's a very energizing time. I'm very heartened by the possibilities. I've experienced firsthand the power of education and culture to bring the people of our countries together. I've witnessed and have been humbled by the ability of William and Mary's students to connect with Cubans, with the people of Cuba, whether on our campus or on the island, sometimes in really surprising ways. This slide is an image of the poet on the right, Delphine Prats, and the hand of a student. And this student was one who went on the trip without knowing any Spanish, but she was very interested in being there. She grew up speaking a bit of Russian, and she and this poet, who doesn't speak any English, managed to find common ground. They managed to realize that they shared a language in common, and they continue to be in touch. I'm humbled and inspired by that kind of connection. And I continue to benefit from the support and affirmation and interest of so many. Please know how grateful I am. Gracias. You guys. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thanks. So, you know, the provost was saying that we had to come out from under the bushel basket to share the light. And I have to say, that moment of applause and all these people, I kind of wish there was a bushel basket. The stage is not my forte. What we will do now is dedicate some time to questions. And our first question, while the microphones are being put in position, as you ask questions, please wait for the microphone to arrive so that everyone can hear. But in the meantime, we have Aaron, who's going to share one of the questions from an online participant.
Yes, our live stream viewers have been tweeting their questions using the hashtag RemixCuba. So if Anne-Marie doesn't get to your questions tonight, you can submit them on Twitter and use the hashtag, and we will make those responses available online. Our first question is, why did you first visit Cuba?
Back to the beginning. So I first visited Cuba, I think I briefly mentioned that I was, maybe I didn't mention this, but I was a graduate student, and I was studying Latin American cinema, and so my professor said, this is a really vibrant place for the study of cinema, and I just kind of trusted her. I think, you know, you never know what your decisions how important they'll be, and at some points you just have to trust advice, and that happened to be really good advice. It was a moment in Cuba that was really important for me to experience because it was before this time of incredible transition. So I actually went to Havana for the first time in 1989, and that was just before all of this transformation. And so it gave me kind of a benchmark of before and a lens through which to consider what came next. Next question. Dr. Kellogg.
What are your plans to travel to Cuba again and to continue this remarkable exchange?
This might come as a surprise, but I have plans to go back. I'm actually heading to Havana on Monday morning. There's a film event, a showcase of work by young filmmakers, and the Cuban edition of my book has been published, and I've been invited to present it in that space because it deals in great part with this newer generation of filmmakers. So I'm thrilled to say I'm heading back to Havana on Monday for that event. In terms of projects at William & Mary, I'm really excited about continuing to build this collection of material, digital-born material, print material, I think I can say tens of thousands of photos and hours of filmed material. And so we're working on ways to structure that through a digital humanities initiative that will enable that to be accessed by the crowd, as we say, by people around the world. So those are some of the immediate plans. Yes, Rio. Sorry, Richard, you're next.
So I'm curious about this opening up moment, and I'm wondering if, I'm thinking specifically about the way in which Cuba has, I think, maybe protected is too strong a word, but protected its film industry, it made it something very sort of autochthonous to Cuba. And I'm wondering about this opening up and if there's concern among the filmmakers about the sort of the influx of like big Hollywood films. Like, what does that mean for a film industry that's been so resource scarce and had to sort of adapt and be very local? I'm just curious if there's discussions about that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting moment. I think Cuban filmmakers are very excited about the possibilities. I think it's actually the Cuban Film Institute and the Cuban government that's struggling a bit. There's a debate right now, a polemic, if you will, between the filmmakers and the Ministry of Culture over this new film law. They're trying to work out a film law that would, and this has been done elsewhere in Latin America and beyond, but kind of a protectionist law that would require, for example, foreign productions to hire a certain number of locals at a certain salary. Some limitations, these kinds of agreements often limit the percentage of films that can be from outside, and so you're absolutely right that those conversations are taking place. I think, though, the filmmakers aren't the ones who are most concerned. I think they're seeing opportunities for greater collaboration, greater connection. But I also think time will tell. Another interesting point related to this is that it is now possible for Cubans to leave Cuba, work elsewhere, and return home. They can retain their property, retain their citizenship, their rights, and so that's becoming, it's becoming much more fluid. It doesn't have to be either or, inside or outside. And so you are seeing more collaboration. There's a new film coming out that's an Irish-Cuban co-production, and I'm really excited to see that and to hear more about that. Richard.
Yeah, my question has to do with in 1959 when, excuse me, when the industry started in Cuba. There certainly had to be some kind of cinematic influence. For example, the New Wave in France or Eisenstein's Russian movies, they would be the kinds of movies that, given the political aspect of the New Wave, but also the political aspect of Eisenstein's movies, could be shown in Cuba. What were the influences on these young directors at the beginning of the Cuban revolutionary cinema?
Great question. Two of the major film directors, Tomás Gutiérrez Alea and Julio García Espinosa, actually studied in Rome. So Italian neorealism was very, very important in those early years. Filmmakers from around the world got really excited about Cuba and actually went to Cuba to be working with Cubans. So for example, the Canadian animation filmmaker Norman McLaren worked there. Filmmakers from a range of countries. There's a Soviet-Cuban co-production from the early 60s. So some of the influence was from Cubans who had studied elsewhere. Cubans before the revolution had studied in Paris and Madrid and New York, and they were bringing that back. Other Cubans were studying in Rome, as I mentioned, and then we had these international filmmakers and intellectuals coming to Cuba, eager to be part of building this new revolutionary culture.
Yeah, Professor Stock, just a question back here. I'm just curious, what is your favorite Cuban drink? What beverage do you...
Now, where are you? Because this voice... David Culver.
And I brought my family too. I brought my Cuban mother. She did leave Cuba in 1961. And my cousin here too. I just wanted to point out, I mean, I know the answer to that,
You know, you're blowing my mind.
But just to speak to who this woman is, I mean, she is incredible. And I don't know if you've watched any of the coverage since President Obama has been there, but all the stories, the feature stories you'll see done on Cuba were done about 8 months ago on our network because of this woman right here. She really was the first to get us in there, the first to talk to these people, and it's true. I'll come see you after the reception.
It's so wonderful that you're here, and I can't resist mentioning something I left out earlier, that as part of our learning experience in Cuba over spring break, David was generous enough to share his family with us. So we went to Santiago de Cuba, and there, all 20 of us went to meet his great aunt. So that was something to kind of pack into her house. And we went not just to be passive observers, we went with our projects. One student wanted to film the kitchen because she was working with her professor on a textbook and they needed some images of a kitchen. Others were interviewing and photographing and filming, and David's great aunt just went with the flow. Actually, she loved it, and if I recall, she told a couple of off-color jokes that I won't repeat in this setting, but it's so wonderful to have you here.
Hello.
It would be that M drink, it would be that mojito.
So, when we left Carlos Rodriguez, when he visited William and Mary when I was in your class, he was still working on Rodriguez versus Rodriguez. He said he was in the process of, I think, trying to arrange a meeting between, no, let me back up, okay. Has he successfully gotten his parents to meet yet? Can you give us like a production update on where he's at?
Yeah, you know, he actually took a slight break from this Rodriguez versus Rodriguez in order to do another short film, which he's just finished. And so now he's getting back to this project, but he's coming to Miami to do some more filming of his father. I believe he said late March, was it, or late April? It's sometime this spring, Michael. It's coming up. So The project continues to go forward, and both of his parents are committed to meeting up as part of the filming. So I think he's aiming to have that shot completely by summer so that he can then work on the editing. He realizes this is the time, you know, this story is really compelling right now.
We have another question from our online viewers. What's next for you and William and Mary in Cuba?
Well, I do believe I mentioned I'll be back there next week. And I'm moving more closely to this grand project to create, expand, archive a lot of this material. Think about new ways this can impact teaching and learning. Beyond that, though, you know, I have some dreams that will take me to Cuba, probably for longer periods of time down the road. I'm not ready for retirement yet. You can see why that is. It's pretty wonderful doing what I do. But I do think, having watched Cuba change over the past almost 30 years, I'm very excited to continue to be a witness to what happens in the future, and certainly to remain connected with special people there. I feel, you know, I feel like some of my dearest friends happen to live in Cuba, and actually some of my family, adopted family, is there too. So definitely there's much more to come. I'm just not seeing clearly what that will look like. And that might be, that future-oriented question might be the time to say, Provost Halloran, would you like to join me?
Yeah. Well, first, thank you for a delightful lecture.
My pleasure. Thanks. Thank you.
But thanks more than for the lecture, for the work that you've been doing here for 23 years, because it so deeply embodies what we value at William & Mary. You're engaging our research, you're engaging our students in research. You have a strong international focus, an interdisciplinary focus, and it really is what we do best, and it's because of people like you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know what the future holds in the long term, but in the short term, there is a reception. So if you just go up these steps to Chesapeake, Tidewater, well, one or the other, Tidewater, and let's continue the conversation there. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Gracias a ti. That was nice.